parents.
Okay.
So that's, every family is different. And that is a rare situation. That doesn't happen that often for someone from a small community. So she didn't escape because her parents actually sanctioned her exiting the church. And then others resign. And by resign, I mean they've already been baptized and or even married and then resign in that way. Like they leave the church and aren't practicing anymore.
Okay. So what was it like being 15 and then suddenly being in a world that maybe you didn't quite understand anymore? And where did you, when you escaped from, I think you said you were in Michigan, where did you escape to?
I had a couple uncles who had also escaped when they were young, and one of them lived in Wisconsin. He picked me up in the middle of the night, drove over from Wisconsin, picked me up, took me across state lines into Wisconsin, and put me on a train, Amtrak train, out to Montana to my other uncle who lived out there. So that was my escape in one sentence or a couple sentences.
Sure. I don't mean to kind of skip over that part, but I know we could go into great detail about that.
Well, and also if people want to hear more details, all you have to do is just go on my website and download a couple chapters that is my Amish childhood. You get all the basic details from that.
Right. Yeah. That's true. You did write a book about it, which we'll get into. Okay. So walk me then through your journey from after you escaped until you got into college at Columbia University. And why did you choose an Ivy League school to go to?
Good question.
Yeah.
When I was a little kid, a little Amish kid, somehow I heard about Elvis Presley, and Harvard University. I don't know how that seeped in, except to explain that I hung around my dad a lot, and he was not a farmer. He was in the construction business and had non-Amish clients. So I was around my father all the time. I was listening to him have conversations with his non-Amish clients, and they would talk about whatever was going on, pop culture, news of the day or whatever. And that, I just soaked it in. I was very unusual kid, very precocious. And somehow I got the understanding that Harvard is where the smartest people in the world go. You have to be very smart to get into Harvard. And I love school. I love learning. I lived in books. I say that books are my passport to the universe. That's what I learned about the outside world, was really through books. So I couldn't really learn that much about the outside world. I was observing you guys just as much as you observe us.
Right.
So there was that distance. I couldn't get very close. There was a barrier there. But through the books that I read, which were classic American and British authors back in the day from the 1970s, amazing books. So that's where I got my ideas from. So I thought, okay, I want to be a Harvard student. I'm going to go to school at Harvard. And by the time I escaped, I didn't feel that I would ever be able to go to college. My highest aspiration was to be a valedictorian from high school. Mm-hmm. I didn't feel that I could go to college because English isn't my first language, and I was not fluent in it. Mm-hmm. And what happened was that I took a year of college, and then my second year I did my GED, or technically a high school equivalency diploma. And I completed it in one semester, but I wasn't 18 yet, so I had to stay in school. So my guidance counselor said, hey, I'm sorry, you can't drop out of school. You got to stay in school until you're 18. Mm-hmm. So why don't you take a college class? The high school will pay for it. So I chose English writing to see if, would I be any good at it? Could I actually do the college level writing? Mm-hmm. And I aced it. And by the time I got to the midterms, after I got my midterm exams back, I talked to my guidance counselor and said, hey, what do I need to do to go to school? Or to college. I want to go to college. So at that point, I still was not confident about my abilities to go to an Ivy League school. And I was not going to get a rejection letter because that's the only thing, I base my self-worth on was my academic abilities. I had no other, gauge of confidence for myself. I mean, had gone through hell already. I was not affirmed, as a child, beyond, for whatever reason, I don't understand other than that, oh, you're smart in school. Mm-hmm. So I clung to that. And, so I decided I wanted to travel and I wanted to visit every country in the world, including going into outer space. And the only practical way to do that was to become a pilot. So I picked a college that had an aviation program. And that landed me in the middle of Kansas. I'm not kidding. Dorothy in Kansas, like the Wizard of
Oh, yeah. So that would have been Kansas University? Or Kansas State?
No. So here's the twist.
Not even those. Okay.
No. So I was still grappling with Christianity and whether or not there was a God, or like if I displeased this Judeo-Christian temperamental God, I'd go to hell. So I was not comfortable going to a state school. I felt that I wouldn't fit in and that the kids just partied and I'd just be a misfit. And so I looked for Christian universities in the U.S. And the only school that had an aviation program at the time was this 2-year Mennonite liberal arts school, Heston College in Heston, Kansas. So that's where I ended up at for my first year of college. So at age 18, I got my pilot certification, which means I can fly single-engine planes.
That's cool.
And yeah, pretty cool.
Do you fly? I mean, sorry to get sidetracked. Do you fly at all? No? I
have not flown in quite a few years. You never lose your license. Technically, it's a certification, not a license. So you never lose that. However, you have to stay current. Current means you have to do a minimum of 3 takeoffs and landings and pass your emergency maneuvers. Okay. So I'm not current. All I have to do is just hop in a plane with a flight instructor and get my little signature that I pass the maneuvers. So. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry to sidetrack you on that one. Okay. Please continue.
So then what happened after my first year at Heston College, I was very, very, dissatisfied with the school. I felt very, religiously oppressed, similarly to the Amish. It was, glorified Amish. I was upset that they required me to go to chapel and did not specify that in the application material. So this is where my legalistic mind comes into play, where like when I applied to Heston, nowhere in your application materials did you say that a condition of my being a student or being in good standing was that I go to chapel X times per week. Mm-hmm. So you cannot force me to go to chapel. And I managed to get out of that. Yeah. Not because I won the legal argument, but because the only out was to get a work study position during that time. So if your work study hours took place during chapel, you were not required to go. So that's how I finagled that. And so after that year, I did another semester of flight training, but that was in Texas, where the weather was very calm, The problem was that nobody in higher education, like the federal loans, for example, they would not cover the extra expense of flight training. It's not considered education. And so you had your liberal arts tuition or regular state community college tuition, whatever, on top of the exorbitant flight training fees. Mm-hmm. And I simply couldn't swing that. My attempt was, the reason for moving to Texas was because the flying weather was better there, where it was not like Kansas, where I do have to say I'm very happy that I trained in Kansas, because you learn how to deal with the winds. You never knew if you were going to be able to fly that day, or if you flew within an hour, you could be experiencing all sorts of different types of weather or wind patterns, and you became a better pilot because of that. But it also tacked on additional training time. So I went to Texas because the weather doesn't move there. The wind is just static.
I like that's a good tagline for Texas, where the weather doesn't move.
After my first semester, I still couldn't swing the additional, to continue getting myself funded. So I dropped out of college for 3 years and worked for an aviation corporation that managed private pilots or other corporate pilots' flight schedules. And that was where I became exposed to the planet as a very finite sort of existence. Like, it wasn't this vast, infinite concept as before. Like, all of a sudden, I began to see the planet and the world in terms of, oh, it's only 6 hours to Europe. Oh, it's only 7 hours to there. It's just 3 hours to South America. It's from London, it's only 6 hours or 12 hours to Dubai or whatever. So the globe shrunk. All of a sudden, things became a lot more possible for me. Mm-hmm. So I would talk to the pilots and ask them where they were going, to places that seemed very exotic to me, and they would talk about it. And I did quite a bit of traveling during that time period. And finally I decided, okay, I want to be in international affairs. I think that's how I can make the world better. I can, if I go into international affairs, I can bring peace to the world or whatever, which now in hindsight is a very naive way of thinking, but that was my idealistic mindset, was to make the world a better place, and feeling that I could save the world. And that's what I learned at Columbia was, no, you can't save the world. You can only save yourself. That's a completely different way of thinking. Mm-hmm. And at that point, then after 3 years, I realized that I didn't have, this would be my last shot at applying as an undergrad to Harvard. And I didn't want to live a life of regrets, so I risked the rejection letter. And I always joke that Harvard rejected me before they got my application. I'm not kidding you. That application arrived the next day. I swear. Wow. That rejection. And I was crushed. That was the end of the world for me. What that meant to me was I wasn't smart, that I didn't have the ability to be one of the educated intellectual elites of the world. Mm-hmm. And I had applied to Columbia University in New York City as my backup school. And I say, really, in my mind, it was a backup school. I had never heard of Columbia University before. I had only looked up the list of Ivy League schools because I'm practical and, okay, well, I want to live in New York, and oh, by the way, Columbia just happens to be there, and so I'll apply, but I'm not going to need it because Harvard's going to take me. And Columbia accepted me. And I really felt like I was going to a second-rate school.
I'm sure they're excited to hear that.
Oh, the